had solid evidence that flexible working can really work well, and hybrid working in particular works really well. My concern is that this whole 5 days back into the office mandate is likely to backfire for organizations. I think they risk losing top talent. I question whether companies really want people back in the office because of productivity, or is it really because there's 20-25% of occupancy rate in like central London, central New York offices, and that's costing billions. It starts with trust. You've got to trust people to do their job. You've got to trust people that are responsible. People need to feel that what they do matters and that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves.
Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Leaders in Talent podcast. And today with me is Nikki Scarr. Nikki is a global HR leader with nearly 2 decades of experience in human resources. She currently works in a leadership and partnership role at DVI Medical, where she helps drive HR strategy and organizational success across the world, leading a global team. But Nikki is also a veteran from the British Army. She brings a unique perspective to leadership, grounded in a sense of purpose and connection to both mission and colleagues, and the ability to build high-performance teams. She's an advocate for flexible, hybrid work models and is passionate about creating inclusive, engaging workplaces that support both businesses in their success and employee well-being. Nikki, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. That sounds delightful.
Nikki, so intriguing and so relevant, right? We have in recent news, recent times, a lot of, especially big corporates, big tech companies, feels a little bit from going anyone can work from anywhere to 5 days back to the office. If you don't like it, you can go and find a job somewhere else. Yeah. What's your perspective and why do you care about this so much?
It's really concerning, isn't it? We've had solid evidence that flexible working can really work well, and hybrid working in particular works really well. I've seen it firsthand. I have seen better outcomes for both employees and companies and a positive impact on D&I. So one of my previous companies took part in a study with London Business School back in 2017, actually, so way before COVID. And it centered around providing our people with freedom to structure the day as they saw fit and what worked for them. And that study found that performance improved in the presence of autonomy, and that the organization then implemented flexible working with a policy which is quite common now of 3 days in the office and 2 days remote.
Are you facing market volatility, need to hire quickly, or have a team that sits idle? Meet Matcher, your flexible recruitment and sourcing partner. Scale your recruitment capacity up or down without compromising on quality. Trusted by Booking.com, Miro, Heineken, Grammarly, and Deal, Matcher is the RPO disruptor making waves in Europe and the US. For scale-ups and corporates, Matcher covers engineering, go-to-market, and G&A roles. Visit Matcher.io to see how we can support you. That's MATCHR.io.
And we did a bit of additional flex on top of that, giving that autonomy, and it was fantastic. It led to great talent attraction and retention. And I've seen it really work. So my concern is that this whole 5 days back into the office mandate is likely to backfire for organizations. I think they risk losing top talent.
Yep.
Especially where we've embraced the flexibility of remote or hybrid work. People have moved further out of cities. They've set their lives up around these things. I've seen a couple of studies recently. So one from Future Forum, they're pretty good at talking about flexible working. And they said 78%, I think, of people want flexible options in terms of location. And 95% of people want some sort of flexibility in their lives. Because our lives are hard. They're hard. It's hard to fit everything in. And then the other one that I read recently was Nicholas Bloom. He's done the China study for working from home. And he found that working from home 2 days a week, just as productive, likely to get more promoted, and far less likely to quit. So there's been some studies that have talked about productivity, and that's what we're seeing in the press a lot recently. But that's completely linked to full isolation. So that the ones that I've read has been about full remote working and productivity linked to people feeling isolated. So we've talked previously, and I think some in-person connection is really important.
Yeah.
But I think flexible working is important too. And there's a little bit of me that's a cynic. So I question whether companies really want people back in the office because of productivity, or is it really because there's 25% of occupancy rate in like central London, central New York offices, and that's costing billions. So I'm a little bit of a cynic that it's just about productivity, if I'm honest.
And also some of the articles I'm reading is the cynical in me is like, is this not the way to get rid of
Yeah.
10, 15, maybe even 20% of headcounts?
Yeah.
What's your take there?
I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
But the thing is, my view would be you're going to lose the great people. You're going to lose your top talent. You're going to lose the people that you want to retain, not the people that you're looking to reduce your workforce. The individuals that aren't as engaged or aren't as aligned to your culture, aligned to what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, I would agree with you there.
Walmart's recently announced as well. It's like everyone back to the office, and the CTO resigned and said,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not moving there. I got my
Yes.
family, got my life here. You hire me fully remote. I could do my work remote, travels a lot, obviously, but wasn't willing to relocate. It's like, I wonder how that conversation in the board went when they came up with this rule
Yeah.
that the CTO decided to resign.
I think it
Yeah.
would have been tricky.
There are different advocates because I've been speaking to a lot of leaders. So also Matcher, we went from an office first culture whereby we had some flexibility with like 1 day of working remotely at our office in Kiev, Ukraine at the time, to during COVID fully remote, and then becoming a fully distributed team. And prior to actually starting, making that decision, I had a conversation with Job van der Voort, who's the CEO and founder of remote.com. He's one of the biggest advocates of fully remote. He worked at GitLab, a fully distributed company before, now remote. It's like, I think, a 1,500 people company, fully remote as well. And he actually said is that hybrid is the hardest model to make it work because you have the worst of two worlds, basically. I feel that every person that I speak to so he obviously is a big advocate of fully distributed. You're more on the hybrid position. And then I spoke to some CEOs said, no, everyone back to the office because we need culture. We need the energy of the office, right? Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit more why you feel that hybrid works well, like in what kind of dynamic and what should companies do thoughtfully that want to have people at least meet in person 1 or 2 times per day?
Why do I think hybrid's really important? I think it's really important because of a sense of connection to people. So I'm in a fully remote role now, but I still travel to site. I still go and meet people. I still foster that sense of connection. I think you can develop it remotely. Absolutely you can. And I'll tell you a funny story, actually. I joined Abcam, my last organization, at the start of COVID. So I had worked there 6 weeks when COVID hit. And so I hadn't actually met most people because I worked in a global role and I hadn't yet traveled. And so I worked for 2 years there before I'd met most of the international colleagues. And as soon as the borders were raised, I jumped on a flight. I went out to the US to meet people from across the world. And one of my colleagues picked me up from the hotel that night, took me to a nail salon. You're thinking, where's this going, Nikki? Took me to a nail salon because it was my birthday, and we were sat there chatting away, and the beautician on the other side of the desk said, "Oh, are you 2 old friends?" And my colleague said, "No, we just met today." And that was because we'd fostered over 2 years, completely remotely, a really strong relationship. But it takes effort. It takes time. It takes people making that effort to make it happen. And Christina and I are still in contact now, and we still work really hard to make that relationship work. And we've seen each other tons of times since. But in terms of practical solutions, I think for organizations, it starts with trust. You've got to trust people to do their job. You've got to trust people that are responsible. And there's a bit of an adage of manage the 95%. So manage the people that are doing their work and treat them like adults. Set clear expectations. I think that's really key. Whether you're remote, whether you're hybrid, whether you're in person in office, that's still the case. But I think the one difference is when you're hybrid or remote, you need to make more of an effort around being really clear on deliverables, really clear on how you're going to communicate and collaborate together, and make one-on-ones much more important and those personal connections strong. So encourage and empower people to do their job, but ensure that you've got those regular touch points. I think that's really helps to foster a sense of connection.
And currently you have a 3-day in the office policy and 2 days remote, right? Am I
That
correct?
My previous organization, yeah. So
Okay.
where I work at the moment, a number of us senior leaders are fully remote because we're in global roles. The closest site to me is 2 hours away. I'll go there tomorrow for some of the town halls and to meet some people. It's a manufacturing environment, so it's slightly
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. In your previous company, 3
Mm,
days to the office, 2 days remote. How did you come up with that framework, and how was this communicated to your employees
yeah.
as well? And what do 3 days in the office look like? Does it mean everyone needs to be there on those specific 3 days? Can people
Yeah.
select them? Tell me a little bit more
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, it's hard. It was through that London Business School study that
Yeah.
found that 3 days in the office was the optimum with 2 days. And there's been other studies like that have said that that is the most productive base for an individual and for an employer. How did we come up with it through that study? How did it work in practice? It was tricky sometimes, if I'm honest, because so we didn't mandate which days people came in. And that meant that you would find that the majority of people came in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday,
Yep.
which is great for collaboration and it's great for having an environment where lots of people are together. But it does mean Monday and Fridays are quite quiet in the office. And sometimes it wasn't an issue for us, but for some organizations, that can mean that if you've worked out your workforce on a 5-day week, you don't have enough space for everyone and all of the kind of support for people on site. What I saw work really well, if I'm honest, is the collaborating around things that are meaningful. What could fall down if you're working in a hybrid model is that people just continue their day to day. I think you've got to put in place things where people collaborate meaningfully or come together meaningfully. So whether it's strategy offsites or brainstorming days, there's been quite a lot of studies about those recently. Those meaningful connections where you bring people together and you say, this is what we're joining together in person for. This is what the meaningful connection is if you're going to bring them together. I've just done one for my new organization that I just joined, and a number of the other HR leaders joined in Craft because we've just opened a site there. So we also combined it with a site visit, but we did a strategy session. And BVI are doing one in January for all of the leadership team to do a week together. Those things, I think, are what make hybrid work. When it's 2 days, 3 days, whatever that looks like, I think you've got to do that with a sense of connection with teams. So maybe that's the days that you do your team meetings, right? Maybe that's the days that you do your face-to-face one-to-ones. Nobody wants to drive to an office to sit there on Teams calls all day in a room by themselves. Like, that's not going to work. You've got to create that sense of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
collaboration there.
Yeah, yeah. People coming to the office and then still being stuck in like Zoom calls or Teams calls, right?
And
Like,
it's happened to me, right? It
yeah,
has
yeah, yeah,
happened to
yeah, yeah.
me. But you've got to make it meaningful. And I think, like, gone are the days where meaningful means a great place to work means having free coffee and a pool table and those things. You've got to foster that sense of purpose and connection.
Yeah. In terms of fully back to the office, right?
Yeah.
How does that impact the E&I strategies and like attracting diverse candidates
Yeah.
and talents?
Well, I can talk as a working parent myself. So I've got a
Yeah.
1-year-old. And I think it's really tough. It's really tough if you don't have support around you. I'm really lucky that I do. But when companies push for people to return to the office, we know it disproportionately impacts women and other caregivers, as well as those that are already underrepresented in the workforce. Statistically, we've seen that hybrid work has been shown to benefit gender diversity because it gives people more flexibility. I think rigid office mandates like the 5 days risk undermining those DEI impacts. And it's not just about gender diversity. So you have a ripple effect across all aspects of DNI. So accessibility. There's been plenty of studies about wheelchair users and others finding working environments less accessible, whether it's neurodiversity, whether it's supporting employees from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I'm a huge advocate of social mobility. And think about it, that extra parking cost, the additional childcare for your commute for those 2 hours a day, the cost of travel, that could be the balance for a family between putting food on the table or not, and whether it makes financial sense for both parents to work. Like, in that environment, it can have a huge impact on
Some of the clients that we work for, they have a return back to office policy, or they've always had that. So from the start. But what I see when I come to their offices and like build relationship with the people internally is that often senior leadership, because they need to travel a lot, they're not in the office. So they don't experience what it's like, what a 5-day in the office policy actually means, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I find mind-boggling. Practice what you preach, then you also need to be there all the time versus like constantly on the road and traveling and effectively just being one day in the office and not seeing there's definitely benefits, but also what it does,
Yeah.
especially to people that are affected by it, that have young children or need to commute really far, right? Of coming to the office. In terms of making hybrid or remote work, how to do this effectively? You touch upon a little bit, right? Trust is really important, but like give me a little bit more. Like, what do you consider as like, okay, a company's considering this, or is in this navigation of like, hey, what do we want to do going forward? Yeah, what are some of your practical tips?
My biggest practical tip would be talk to your teams.
Yeah.
Actively listen to their challenges, their needs, what works for them, understand the nuances around where people are located, their individual situations, how those impact their work. I think feedback loops are really critical. So you can do surveys, one-to-ones, stay interviews. I'm going to fangirl Samantha Gadd from your previous session that you did on this podcast because she had some great like questions and tips for stay interviews. But I think it's about creating a place where people want to work. And I said about the coffee and the perks and things like that, but none of that matters if you don't have a long-standing kind of sense of engagement to the organization and a sense of purpose. I think people need to feel that what they do matters and that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. And whether that's the company mission or the success of the organization, being aligned to that, I think is really important.
And how does that materialize, right? Like that
Yeah.
sense of purpose and fostering that connection.
Yeah. Well, it sounds really cliche, doesn't it?
Cliches
but there's
are cliches for a reason, right?
There's a story that I love. I don't
Yeah.
love the story, and you might have heard it. There's a janitor at NASA when JFK went to the Space Center, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And the janitor said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." And that's what purpose is for me. I'm not a scientist, right? I wasn't a scientist at UBCAM. I'm not a scientist at BVI. But the work that BVI does is about improving people's sight and ultimately impacting patients' lives. I'm a HR leader. I help the business be successful. And through talented people that do that incredible science, I have impact upon patients' outcomes. And I think I didn't realize how important that was to me till a few years ago. And I think it does come back to like when I was in the army. And since then, I've sought out organizations that give me that sense of purpose. But it's not just around what's on paper, it's about showing them what they do fits into the bigger picture, how they contribute to something that matters, where that engagement truly comes from is that sense of connection. And you said to me, how do you build that? I think it's
Yeah.
about being super intentional with your communication activities, whether that's virtual coffee chats. And at ABCAM, we did that amazingly with monthly pairings across the organizations, 15, 20 minutes, chat about anything. You could be paired with the CEO, you could be paired with the receptionist, you could be paired with anyone in the organization, but creating that sense of connection with each other, bringing the science to life. I work for life sciences, medical devices companies. So sessions like lab tours or deeper insights into products. It was really great for me when I was working in antibodies during COVID. I could then understand and talk about them to my families because they understood it then. You can share customer reviews. You can help employees connect with the work through those customer stories, the positive results from surveys, how your values are living out. I think actually a good example would be last month, one of the first site visits I did with BVI was to attend our UK-based site on World Site Day. It's a internationally marked day for which lots of charities observe. And on site, we had a charity that came in that works with the blind. And one of the activities was to wear a set of goggles that had been adapted to demonstrate different eye conditions. Now, I can't imagine what it's like to live with any form of sight loss and how challenging that must be every day. But in that moment, in that small activity, I got a small insight into what that might be like. And I also got an insight into the connection to what our scientists are developing and how that impacts the patient's life when they can see again. That's huge. And that's not hard to do. Invite a charity and talk to them. Say, hey, can you come? They'll do it for free. They'll come on site and help you. And another way that you can do that is to get employee resource groups together. So they don't have to be leader-led, doesn't have to be HR-led. In fact, I'd advocate for it not being. But you get groups of people together that have got a shared insight, that have shared experiences to engage and support each other, and you create a sense of belonging. They're more likely to stay engaged, contribute to the team's success, and you actually get that feedback loop as an organization about what can you do differently? How can we improve things? When you think about returning to the office, you can go speak to them and say, hey, group, how's this going to impact the people that you know, that you experience? What do we need to be mindful of? And use them as advocates, because if you are in a situation where you need to make a change to a workforce plan, they're a great sounding board of advice and support. Yeah, I've just seen it work really well with those kind of collaboration days, as I said before.
Have you ever been in
Creating
an
that.
environment or spoken to people where it doesn't work, right? When the setup wasn't right?
Yeah, there's been times actually over the last few years, I think with hiring quite a lot of people remotely, and where, you know, organizations haven't necessarily enforced or created some of those sense of connection, collaboration. What I've seen happen is that people are disengaged and they think, I can do my job fully remotely from home. I don't need to be in this meeting. I don't need to be in person. I don't need to do those things. And they don't see the benefits. I think what I'm worried about in that environment is the next generation of individuals coming through the workforce that aren't getting that support, or they don't know how to do things. And the ad hoc individual support that you give on a day-to-day basis. You think of the start of your career, you would have leant over a
Yeah.
desk and said, can you help me with this? Or and I look back on when I've sat with my junior HR teams and I've just overheard conversations and I've chipped in and said, oh, did you know you could just do this? Because I'm sat with them. Those are missed if you don't ever have an in-person connection, or you don't physically create those environments remotely. So I've seen companies do little chat sessions online where you've got animated gameplay and you've got people that are joining in a virtual environment and having that sense of connection and co-location and chat. I think you've got to be meaningful and considered and create those. You can't just expect it to just work.
I just read Atlassian's study, fully remote company,
Yeah.
and their white paper was basically our learnings after 1,000 days of being fully remote. And a couple of things stood out for me because, true to be told, I struggle with being a fully remote company for a variety of different reasons. One, we are growing, and I find it harder and harder with a growing team, especially that's rapidly expanding, to have people onboarded into culture, but especially to feel connected with the other colleagues that are there. We work for in client teams, so the people that work together on a client, they're very closely together. The people that work on client A have nothing to do with client B, right? And they only interact at an account lead meeting or like at any of the other social activities. And then still, when you are together especially when a bigger group of Zoom, everyone goes on mute, listens, and then goes on with their day, right?
So, yeah.
I find it hard to for people to really build that personal connection. That's one. The second thing is I love people. I love the flexibility that remote work gives me, right? I'm calling you right now from New York. You're based in the UK. The world is my oyster. But at the same time, I really miss being the vibe of the office, right? So therefore I was especially interested about the learnings of Atlassian. And I think what was interesting that I read from their study is they still have offices. They do not require anyone to come to the office, but it's an option. But they make a conscious effort of bringing people together several times per year. And to me, we just brought our European team together for the first time. Many of the colleagues I'd never seen. And every single person there was so appreciated and so grateful that we got to spend some time together outside of work and that we built
Yeah.
that social connection. And now I see the energy is radiant
Yeah.
when we interact.
I think that's really key. There's another study actually that you've just reminded me of, and I think it was Microsoft. They looked at all of the activity of their employees over a 3-year period, and they found that when people went remote during COVID, there was less new connections. So where people already had those sense of connection with each other, they continued those. But to forge new connections, like you're saying with client A or client B groups, between them was more tricky because you didn't have that natural opportunity to connect. And that's what that study showed, is that it's harder to create those new bonds, those new connections in a remote environment. And you've heard me, I'm a huge hybrid advocate, whether that's 2 days, 3 days, whatever. If that's fully remote, that you create these sense of connections and people go and meet in person, I think that's what works. And you've got to be meaningful about it. You've got to really create, like you said, going to Europe and bringing people together. It's something that I do every time I get a new leadership team together, is do insights discovery, psychometrics, get them to know each other on a human level, like get them to share stories with each other and create that individual sense of connection. I do things like say to them, bring an item with you that describes you, or something that a team don't know about you. And weird and wonderful things turn up. But then you start hearing people have different connections. I did one earlier this year where we'd had, I want to say, 50 people in a room. And I said, right, you've got to go find a random person in the room that you don't know. And you've got to find 3 things that you have in common with that person. And then you just put them up on a board, like likes wine. It can't be something visual, but likes wine, played soccer at school, and you put them on a board, and lots of people around that support this football team, lots of people around the room start going, hey, like, me too. Either dinner that night or a coffee break, they'll start to have that conversation, and it will be the thing that they remember about that person. I think we have a responsibility as leaders or as HR professionals to help people do that. And that's where we add value.
So good. Nikki, this was such a pleasure talking to you. And I think it's a very relevant topic for many people in our industry. Nikki, what's the best way for our audience to connect with you? Is it LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'm not on anything else yet.
Awesome.
LinkedIn is where you'll find me. And I love connecting with people that are like-minded.
Perfect. Nikki, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you.